All right, so I'd like to welcome Dr. Amanda Rowe. Thank you so much for speaking with me tonight, Amanda. The work that you do is pretty exciting. There's been some great um, advances in the Asian longhorn beetle. I hope I'm saying that right. The Asian longhorn beetle, and I'd love for you to share with the audience what it is that you've been doing and a little history about where we are now.
Sure, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to speak to you today.
Mm-hmm.
So I work at the Canadian Forest Service with Natural Resources Canada in Sault Ste. Marie. And my interest in the Asian longhorn beetle comes from the fact that this is an invasive species.
Mm-hmm.
It was found in Canada, down in southern Ontario,
Mm-hmm.
and we had to respond rapidly to control this species.
Right.
It presents a really a high risk to our forests.
Yeah.
It feeds on a wide range of different hardwood species, particularly maple. And as any Canadian knows, maple is our emblem on the flag. And it's a really important species for the Canadian economy, both through forestry as well as maple syrup production.
Right. Yes.
Now,
Very regional specific as well for us, for sure.
Absolutely, especially in Sault Ste. Marie. We take our maple syrup pretty seriously up here, and it is a very important part of our local economy.
Right.
And this is a species that has spread from its native range in Asia throughout North America and in Europe. So it's recognized as being a really high risk,
right,
because it lives inside trees. And it can move unseen through economic trade, and it's really in what we call wood packaging material. So a thing like a pallet.
Yeah. So
it can actually survive inside the wood of a pallet as a larvae and move through on a boat, through trade pathways, and end up in areas where it's not supposed to be.
Right.
And when it comes out as an adult, it will look for a tree to feed on, and that might be a tree in a neighborhood in a city, which is what happened in Toronto. What's fortunate is we detected that infestation early, and that detection allowed us to respond and seek to eradicate the population. So that was in 2003 down in Toronto,
and there was a bit of a partnership. Were there some organizations that came together quite successfully?
Absolutely.
I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a really good example of how important partnerships across different governments at different levels can be for responding to an invasive species. So the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, who is the main regulatory body and is responsible for responding to an invasive species like the Asian longhorn beetle, partnered with Natural Resources Canada, and particularly researchers at our lab here in Sault Ste. Marie.
Oh, great.
As well as
of course, makes sense.
The provincial partners and municipal partners of the Toronto and the Peel region, down in southern Ontario, and together they identified the site, the invasion, and developed a quarantine zone around that, and removed any potential host.
Oh, that must have been heartbreaking to see those trees come down.
It's true. There was a significant impact within that quarantine zone.
Yeah.
However, if you think in terms of the Canadian forest landscape as a whole, it was a response that was necessary to protect our overall forest landscape.
It's like COVID-19 for trees. Quarantine. And that's part of your specialty, actually. Sorry, Amanda, that's part of your specialty, quarantine. That's really, you're just on the cusp of many things here.
Yeah, and one of the questions that comes up is where did that invasive population that we had down in Toronto, where did it come from?
Yeah.
And when you find an insect or a plant or any sort of invasive, it's very difficult to trace that pathway.
Mm-hmm.
But every organism carries a genetic code, which is the instruction book for making that individual.
Mm-hmm.
And the genetic code can carry a lot of information about its history, and you can actually use some of those that information to trace it back to its source.
Wow.
So just like we can screen humans for COVID variants,
right.
we can identify unique variants in the Asian longhorn beetle and use that to figure out where these individuals came from.
Wow.
And that's one of the things that we're developing is a tool to be able to help us identify where invasive populations of Asian longhorn beetle originated from. And one of the questions that we're really keen to be able to identify is not only where it came from in its native range, but did it come through a secondary site? So was it coming directly from Asia, or did it hop through a number of other places to get to Canada?
Right.
Because that's a really important question.
Yeah, it is.
For the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and the Canadian Border Services, because they need to identify which pathways are the highest risk.
Right. It's contract tracing. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Amanda.
Because we aren't able to, we have a limited number of people and resources to be able to inspect goods that are coming into Canada. We can't check every single pallet that comes into Canada, whether from the States or from overseas. And so if we can identify places which are higher risk, we can then focus our resources on those higher risk pathways to prevent the introduction of invasive species or new populations of invasive.
Yes. Yeah, the education component it's imperative that people come to understand and be able to recognize what it is that they might be seeing if they're out in the wilderness one day. So can you talk to me about that? The burn it where you buy, or buy it where you burn it, I think is a campaign that's underway.
Burn it where you buy it. Yeah. So there's actually two really important parts to an invasive species response plan. And the big part of any response plan is to detect new invasives and new populations early.
Right.
And this is where the general public is absolutely critical in our ability to do that, because experts like myself or inspectors with the regulatory agencies, they can't be everywhere.
Right.
But people who are curious and observant can identify something that's not right or something that's unusual. And if they recognize it as being different and take a picture, because everyone's got a camera in their pocket now.
For sure.
And share that with a group on media, like a social media group, where experts are always sort of watching for pictures to come by of potential of unusual insects to a private citizen who recognized something as being unusual or different. It wasn't an expert that took the first picture or raised the red flag. It was a private citizen, and that's where their role is really critical in our ability to respond.
Yeah, exactly.
But the other piece, as you mentioned, is to prevent movement of potential invasive species in our own country. Yeah. And firewood, particularly for things like Asian longhorn beetles that live inside of trees, where you can't see them, is really critical not to move firewood. And keeping firewood local. So as you had said, you burn it where you buy it. And you try and prevent movement of those invasive species within our own country, because it's really, I know how easy it is just when you have property and you have a tree that you've taken down because it was starting to die, and you it's a hazard tree and you want to use that wood, you just throw it in the back of your truck and take it camping. But the problem is that tree was dying for a reason, and you don't necessarily know why, and the risk is that it might have been something like an invasive species that might have made that tree sick, and you don't want to spread that to other forests.
And I think you were saying things like there aren't really any predators, especially, I mean, if they get somewhere where they don't belong already, and they're happy to go through a hardwood stand in no time, then even if a bird gets it, it could be depositing it somewhere else. So it's critical that it gets stopped, like you say, at the micro level first. Yeah.
And that's kind of that's one of the biggest issues around invasive species, is that they're from a different ecosystem.
Yeah.
They've been brought into an area that hasn't ever experienced that organism. And with a natural ecosystem, there's a whole community that species is involved with. There are plants that it might eat, but there's also all sorts of other insects and other animals that feed on that species within its natural community. But when it's taken out of that and put into a naive environment, then it leaves behind all of those other species that act as a check or a balance to its population growth. And since you've lost that check or balance, there's nothing to bring those numbers back down. And the plants that they start feeding on aren't used to having that organism, and they have no ability to respond to that threat or that species that's feeding on it.
Right. Well, listen, this has been amazing. Thank you so much. And that we are right now in Invasive Species Week. So for folks wanting to get engaged with Amanda or any other expert in the field, the social media campaign's well underway, and you just hashtag Invasive Species Week or some version of that. You'll be able to find it, put it in your search on the Twitter or Instagram. I'm more on Twitter, but I know the Instagram and the Facebook's out there too. So, Amanda, thank you so much. You're a mom, and I thank you very much for taking time away from your family tonight and speaking with me. And I look forward to continuing to engage with you and other scientists at that wonderful facility that we call the Great Lakes Forest Research Center. Is that what it's still? Am I saying that right? The Great Lakes?
It's a Great Lakes Forest Center.
Great Lakes Forestry Center. Yes, thank you very much. And all the work that goes on inside that building. It's a fantastic resource in our own community. So thank you so much, Amanda.